Welcome back to Verified Fears, where real horror stories find their voice. I'm your host, and today I'm sharing 11 deeply disturbing testimonies from the Appalachian Mountains. Stories that were sent to me by people who lived through experiences they'll never forget. The Appalachian Range stretches over 2,000 miles from Georgia to Maine, encompassing some of the oldest mountains on Earth and harboring secrets that have remained buried for generations. These 11 individuals trusted me with their most frightening memories, and now I'm sharing them with you. So settle in, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself for 11 true horror stories from the heart of Appalachian darkness. My name is Oakley, and I'm a 28-year-old geology graduate student at the University of Kentucky. What I'm about to tell you happened 6 months ago during my thesis research on karst formations in the Mammoth Cave region. I've always been methodical, analytical, the kind of person who measures twice and cuts once. My professors used to joke that I was too careful for fieldwork, that I'd never make any groundbreaking discoveries if I didn't take risks. After what happened in that cave, I realized careful isn't a flaw. It's what kept me alive. I was working on mapping uncharted cave systems southeast of the main Mammoth Cave complex. My advisor, Dr. Martinez, had given me access to some old geological survey reports from the 1970s that mentioned several unexplored passages in the area. The bureaucracy around cave exploration in Kentucky is intense. But my university had the proper permits, and I'd completed all the required safety training. I'd been caving since I was 12. My dad used to take me spelunking in Missouri caves every summer. I knew what I was doing, or at least I thought I did. The entrance I was investigating was barely mentioned in the reports. Just a footnote about a small opening requiring further study. It was located about 3 miles off the main tourist routes, accessible only by hiking through dense forest and climbing down a steep limestone outcrop. The opening itself was maybe 4 feet high and 2 feet wide, hidden behind a curtain of thick mountain laurel. You'd never find it unless you were specifically looking for it. I'd been mapping the initial chambers for about 2 hours when I first heard it. At first, I thought it was just the sound of water dripping in a distant chamber. Caves are full of ambient noise that can play tricks on your mind. But as I stopped to check my equipment, I realized what I was hearing was definitely not water. It was singing. A child's voice, soft and melodic, echoing from somewhere deeper in the cave system. My first instinct was concern. A child had no business being this deep in an unmapped cave. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there? Are you okay?" The singing stopped immediately. The silence that followed was absolute. No dripping, no air movement, nothing. I waited for maybe 30 seconds, then called out again. This time, the singing resumed, but it seemed to be coming from further away. I checked my compass and marked my position on my map. I'd been following the main passage, which had been trending northeast at a slight downward angle. The singing was definitely coming from that direction. I gathered my equipment, headlamp, backup lights, rope, emergency supplies, and headed deeper into the cave. Every few yards, I'd stop and call out, but the singing would always stop when I made noise, then resume when I was quiet. The passage began to narrow after about 50 yards. I had to remove my backpack and push it ahead of me through some sections. This should have been my first warning sign. In proper cave exploration, you never continue into a passage that you can't easily retreat from. But I was convinced there was a child in trouble, and my protective instincts overrode my training. The singing was getting clearer now. It was definitely a young voice, maybe 6 or 7 years old, singing what sounded like an old lullaby. I couldn't make out all the words, but I caught fragments. Down in the valley, where the cold winds blow. Sleep now, my darling. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl. It was too perfect, too pure for this environment. After about 10 minutes of crawling, the passage opened into a small chamber, maybe 12 feet across and 8 feet high. I stood up and swept my headlamp around the space. The walls were covered in flowstone formations, and there were several passages leading off in different directions. The singing was coming from the passage directly across from where I'd emerged. I called out again, and again the singing stopped. I examined the new passage. It was larger than the one I'd just crawled through, tall enough for me to walk upright. My equipment readings showed good airflow, which meant it connected to the surface somewhere. I marked my position again and continued forward. The passage curved to the left, then right, then left again. After about 100 yards, it opened into another chamber, this one much larger. This is where things started to feel wrong. When I swept my light around this new chamber, I noticed something that made no geological sense. The passage I'd just come through was nowhere to be seen. I turned around 3 times, checking every wall, but the opening I'd used to enter the chamber had simply vanished. In its place was solid limestone wall, as if the passage had never existed. I forced myself to stay calm. Cave systems can be disorienting, especially when you're focused on following a sound. I'd obviously taken a wrong turn somewhere. I checked my compass, but the needle was spinning wildly, unable to find magnetic north. My GPS unit showed no signal, which was expected this deep underground. I marked the chamber on my map and began systematically checking each passage leading out of the space. That's when the singing started again. But now it was coming from behind me. I spun around, but the chamber was empty. The voice was definitely closer now, clear enough that I could make out more of the words. Come down to the water, where the stones are deep. Come down to the darkness, where the lost ones sleep. The melody was the same, but the lyrics were different now, darker. I called out again, my voice echoing strangely in the chamber. I'm here to help. Where are you? Can you see my light? The singing stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then I heard something that made my blood freeze. The sound of small footsteps, bare feet on stone, coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond my light. I followed the sound, moving as quietly as possible. The footsteps seemed to stay just at the edge of my hearing, always about 20 feet ahead. The passage I was following began to slope downward more steeply. My altimeter showed I was descending rapidly, much faster than should have been possible. The air was getting colder, and I noticed my breath beginning to fog. After what felt like 10 minutes, but according to my watch was nearly an hour, I emerged into the largest chamber I'd ever seen in a cave. My headlamp beam couldn't reach the far walls or the ceiling. The space felt enormous, cathedral-like. And somewhere in that vast darkness, the child was singing again. But now I could hear there wasn't just one voice. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all singing the same lullaby in perfect harmony. Children's voices, all different ages, all singing about coming down to the darkness where the lost ones sleep. The sound was coming from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off invisible walls and vanishing into the black void above. I tried to retreat, to find the passage I'd used to enter this impossible chamber. But just like before, it had disappeared. I was standing on a narrow ledge of stone, and beyond it, my light revealed nothing but empty space. I dropped a stone into the darkness and never heard it land. The singing continued, growing louder, more insistent. That's when I noticed the carvings. Scratched into the stone wall beside me were hundreds of names, carved by different hands, some old and weathered, others sharp and fresh. I read them by my light. Sarah, age 6, 1923. Tommy, age 8, 1960. Lisa, age 7, 1994. The newest one made my hands shake. Emma, age 5, 2024. I realized with growing horror what this place was. These weren't the names of lost children. These were the children, still here, still singing their endless lullaby in the darkness. And they wanted me to join them. I ran. I don't remember making a conscious decision to run, but suddenly I was moving. My light bouncing wildly as I searched desperately for any passage, any way out. The singing grew louder behind me, more urgent, as if the voices were calling me back. I found a crevice in the rock barely wide enough for my body and squeezed through, scraping skin off my arms and legs, not caring about anything except getting away from those voices. The next 3 hours are a blur of panic and desperation. I crawled through passages that seemed to rearrange themselves when I wasn't looking. Climbed through chambers that defied every law of physics I knew, followed air currents that led nowhere. My backup lights failed one by one. My water ran out. The singing followed me everywhere, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always there. I finally found daylight when I was down to my last few minutes of battery power. I emerged from a completely different cave entrance, nearly 2 miles from where I'd started, torn and bleeding and half out of my mind. Park rangers found me stumbling along a hiking trail, mumbling about singing children. They said I'd been missing for 18 hours. I tried to explain what happened, but my map showed a route that was geologically impossible. The cave system I described doesn't exist according to any survey. The entrance where I started my exploration was examined by a team of experts, but they found nothing beyond the first chamber. Just solid rock where I swear there had been passages. I never finished my thesis. I changed my major to surface geology and transferred to a university in Kansas, as far from caves as I could get. But sometimes, when the wind is quiet and the night is still, I can still hear them singing. Those children in the darkness, still waiting for someone to come down to the water where the stones are deep, down to the darkness where the lost ones sleep. I keep thinking about that last carving, Emma from 2024. I looked up missing children reports from the Mammoth Cave area. Emma Rodriguez, age 5, disappeared during a family camping trip last summer. They never found her body. But I know where she is. She's down there with the others, singing in the dark, adding her voice to the endless lullaby that echoes through chambers that shouldn't exist. And sometimes, in my worst moments, I wonder if part of me is still down there too. My name is Hendricks, and I've been mining coal in Harlan County, Kentucky for 23 years. My daddy did it, and his daddy before him. It's in my blood, you could say. Though after what I found down there 6 months ago, I'm starting to think some blood runs poison. I'm 45 years old, got a wife and 2 kids, and until that night in October, I thought I knew everything there was to know about the Black Rock mine. Turns out, I didn't know nothing at all. For the mine's been operational since 1952, owned by Cumberland Coal Corporation. It's not the biggest operation in the county, but it's steady work, and steady work is hard to come by around here. Most of the guys I work with are 2nd or 3rd generation miners like me. We joke that coal dust is in our DNA, that we were born with black lungs and headlamps for eyes. It's a hard life, but it's honest work, and I always took pride in that. The night shift pays better, and with my youngest starting high school next year, I'd been picking up extra shifts whenever I could. Usually there's 4 or 5 of us working nights, but that particular Tuesday, it was just me and Rodriguez scheduled. Then Rodriguez called in sick with his back acting up again, so it was just me going down into the dark at 11 p.m. Foreman Jenkins didn't like sending a man down alone, but the quota pressure from corporate had been intense lately, and we needed the coal out of Section C. Section C was the newest part of the mine, opened about 6 months earlier. It was deeper than the rest of the operation, nearly 800 feet down, and the tunnels were narrower than what we usually worked. The coal seam down there was rich, though, high-grade anthracite that the company was real excited about. I'd worked that section maybe a dozen times, always during day shifts with a full crew. Going down there alone felt different, quieter somehow. I took the cage down at 11:15 p.m., my lunch pail and thermos rattling against the metal grating as we descended. Charlie, the cage operator, was half asleep at the controls. "You sure about this, Hendricks?" he asked as we passed the 600-foot mark. Don't feel right sending a man down there by himself. I told him I'd be fine, that I'd done this work longer than his son had been alive. Charlie just shrugged and spat into his coffee can. Section C was laid out differently than the main mine. Instead of the wide central tunnel with smaller passages branching off, it was more like a maze. The engineers said it had to do with the geology down there, how the coal seam twisted and turned through the rock. The company had installed electric lights every 50 feet or so, but they were dim and left plenty of shadows between. My headlamp cut through the darkness as I made my way to the coal face, where I'd left off the previous week. I'd been working for about 2 hours when I first noticed something was off. I was using the continuous miner to cut coal from the face when I heard something over the machine noise. Sounded like voices, but that was impossible. I was the only one down there, and the nearest tunnel was a quarter-mile away. I shut off the machine and listened. Nothing but the usual mine sounds. Water dripping somewhere, the occasional settling noise as the mountain adjusted to our digging. I started the machine back up, but the feeling wouldn't leave me alone. Every few minutes, I'd stop and listen, convinced I was hearing something that shouldn't be there. Around 2 a.m., I decided to take my lunch break early. I found a spot where 2 tunnels intersected and sat down with my sandwich and coffee. That's when I heard them clear as day, voices coming from the tunnel to my right. It was 2 men talking, their words echoing off the tunnel walls. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was serious, urgent even. I called out, "Hey, who's down here?" The voices stopped immediately. I waited, listening, but heard nothing. I figured maybe it was sound carrying from some other part of the mine, maybe day shift guys doing maintenance work I didn't know about. But something about those voices bothered me. They didn't sound like any of the guys I worked with. The accent was different, older somehow. Mountain accent, sure, but not quite right for this area. I finished my sandwich and decided to investigate. The tunnel where I'd heard the voices led to an older section of the mine, one that had been sealed off months ago after some structural concerns. The entrance should have been blocked with concrete barriers. The barriers were there, but they'd been moved. Not destroyed or broken through, just carefully repositioned to create a gap wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Fresh footprints in the coal dust led through the opening. I should have gone back, should have radioed up to Charlie and reported what I'd found. Instead, I squeezed through that gap and followed those footprints into a part of the mine I'd never seen before. The tunnels beyond the barriers were older, rougher, hand-carved instead of machine-cut, with timber supports that looked like they'd been in place for decades. My headlamp illuminated old-fashioned mining equipment. Picks and shovels, hand-crank ventilation fans, lanterns instead of electric lights. It was like stepping back in time 40 years. I followed the main tunnel for maybe 100 yards before it opened into a larger chamber. And that's where I found them. File cabinets, dozens of them, lined up against the walls like soldiers. Metal filing cabinets that had no business being 800 feet underground in an abandoned mine section. They were old, rust-stained, but the locks were new. Shiny brass padlocks that hadn't been down there long. I tried the first cabinet, locked tight. The second, same thing. But the third one, the lock was hanging open like someone had forgotten to secure it. I opened the drawer and found files. Hundreds of personnel files, each one stamped with the Cumberland Coal Corporation logo. I pulled out the first file and read the name. William Billy Morrison, hired 1967, died in cave-in 1968. Age 23. My hands started shaking as I opened more files. Every single one followed the same pattern. Name, hire date, death date, cause of death. Always cave-ins, always young men, always after less than 2 years on the job. I found files going back to the mine's opening in 1952. According to these records, Cumberland Coal had been covering up worker deaths for over 70 years. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the handwritten notes clipped to each file. Notes in the same handwriting, dated regularly over the decades. Family paid off, no investigation. Coroner cooperating, cause of death changed to heart attack. Body relocated to unmarked grave, family told he left town. The notes were signed with initials. J.C., same initials as our current company president, James Cumberland. I started grabbing files, stuffing them into my lunch pail and under my shirt. I needed evidence, proof of what I was seeing. That's when I heard the footsteps behind me. Heavy boots on stone, coming from the tunnel I'd used to enter the chamber. I spun around, my headlamp beam cutting through the darkness, but I couldn't see anyone. "Who's there?" I called out. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard that voice again, the same mountain accent I'd heard earlier. "You shouldn't be down here, son. This ain't for your eyes." I started backing toward the far wall, looking for another way out. That's when I saw him. An old man in mining clothes that looked like they belonged in a museum. Hard hat with a carbide lamp, suspenders, boots that were more patch than leather. But the strangest thing was that I could see through him, like he was made of smoke and shadow. "You're not real," I whispered. "You can't be real." The old man smiled, and his teeth were black with coal dust. "Real as the mountains, son. Real as the men who died digging this coal. Real as the lies they told our families." He gestured toward the filing cabinets. "We've been waiting a long time for someone to find these records, someone who could do something about it." More figures started appearing out of the shadows. Dozens of them, all in old mining clothes, all with that same translucent quality. Young men, most of them, with tired eyes and faces streaked with coal dust. They surrounded the filing cabinets, like guards protecting treasure. "Take the files," the old man said. "Take them up to the light. Tell the world what Cumberland Coal done to us. Tell them about the families that never knew what really happened to their boys." I grabbed as many files as I could carry and ran. I don't remember much about getting out of that chamber, just stumbling through dark tunnels with those ghostly voices echoing behind me, encouraging me, urging me forward. I squeezed back through the gap in the barriers and made it to the main section, my heart hammering like a jackhammer. I radioed Charlie to bring the cage down early, told him I wasn't feeling well. He grumbled about it, but 20 minutes later, I was back on the surface, blinking in the parking lot lights with a lunch pail full of evidence. I spent the rest of that week making copies of everything, researching the names in the files. Every single death was real. Billy Morrison, Tommy Kowalski, Frank Delacroix. All young miners who'd supposedly quit or moved away, but whose death certificates I found filed in county records under different names. Cumberland Coal had been systematically murdering workers and covering it up for decades. I took the evidence to the county sheriff first. He looked at the files for about 10 minutes, then told me the records were clearly fake, that someone was trying to damage the reputation of the county's biggest employer. When I insisted, he suggested I might be suffering from the effects of working alone underground. That isolation could cause hallucinations. I tried the state police. Same response. I tried a lawyer in Lexington who advertised on TV that he fought for working people. He wouldn't even look at the files once he heard they involved Cumberland Coal. Too many connections, too much money, too much risk. That's when the accident started happening. My car's brake lines, cut clean through. A gas leak in my house that the utility company swore was impossible. Equipment failures at work that could have killed me if I hadn't been paying attention. The message was clear. Drop it or join those files in the underground chamber. I kept copies of everything hidden in my brother's barn 3 counties over. But I stopped talking about what I'd found. I finished out my shift rotations, kept my head down, counted the days until I could retire with my pension intact. But I never worked Section C again, and I never worked another night shift alone. The mine closed down 2 months ago. Cumberland Coal announced they were consolidating operations, moving to more efficient strip mining. The entrance to Section C was sealed with concrete, officially for safety reasons. I drove out there last week and saw they'd done more than seal it. They'd collapsed the whole section, 800 feet of tunnels, compressed under tons of rock and earth. But I know those files are still down there somewhere, and I know those men are still waiting. Sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I can hear them calling up through all that rock and earth, asking me why I gave up, why I stopped fighting for them. And I don't have a good answer. My name is Hendricks, and I spent 23 years mining coal for a company that's been murdering workers since before I was born. I had the proof in my hands, and I let them bury it. Every time I spend that pension money, I wonder how much of it is stained with the blood of men like Billy Morrison. Men who were just trying to make an honest living in a dishonest world. If you're listening to this, maybe you can do what I couldn't. Maybe you can find a way to bring those files back to the surface. Because those men down there deserve better than being forgotten in the dark. My name is Blakely, and I'm 24 years old. I started through hiking the Appalachian Trail last April with dreams of conquering all 2,190 miles from Georgia to Maine. I'd been planning this trip for 2 years, saving money, buying gear, training on every local trail I could find near my apartment in Charlotte. I thought I was prepared for everything. Bears, weather, difficult terrain, even the occasional weird hiker you meet on the trail. What I wasn't prepared for was being hunted by someone who seemed to know my every move before I made it. The whole thing started on my 15th day out, somewhere along the North Carolina-Tennessee border. I'd been making good time, averaging about 15 miles a day, and my confidence was high. The trail community had been amazing. I'd met dozens of other hikers, shared campsites, traded stories around fires. There's something special about trail culture, the way strangers become family when you're all carrying your lives on your backs. I'd gotten my trail name, Compass, after helping a couple of lost section hikers find their way back to the main trail. Everything felt perfect, like I was living exactly the life I was meant to live. I first noticed him at trail marker 47, about 3 miles south of the Smokies. I was taking a break, eating a granola bar and checking my GPS, when I saw another hiker about 100 yards ahead. He was standing perfectly still beside the trail, just watching me. Even from that distance, Something about his posture felt wrong. Most hikers wave when they see each other, or at least nod. This guy just stood there like a statue. I called out, "Hey there, beautiful day for hiking." My voice carried well in the thin mountain air. He didn't respond, didn't wave, didn't move at all. I figured maybe he was dealing with his own stuff. Sometimes people hike the trail to get away from things, and they're not looking for conversation. I packed up my snack and continued north. But when I reached the spot where he'd been standing, he was gone. No sign of him anywhere. There was nowhere he could have gone that quickly without me seeing. I didn't think much about it until I made camp that evening at Standing Bear Hostel. I was setting up my tent when another hiker, a guy named Mountain Mike, came over to chat. He'd been on the trail for 6 weeks, heading southbound while I was going north. We got to talking about the day's hike, and I mentioned the strange hiker I'd seen. "Tall guy?" Mike asked. "Dark hair, wearing an old external frame pack?" I nodded. That was exactly right. The pack had caught my attention because nobody uses external frames anymore. Mike's expression got serious. "I've been seeing that same guy for 4 days now. Always watching from a distance, never responds when you try to talk to him. Yesterday I saw him near Klingman's Dome, but when I went to introduce myself, he just melted back into the trees. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I'd pitched my tent near the back of the camping area, away from the main cluster of other hikers. Around 2 a.m., I woke up needing to use the bathroom. As I unzipped my tent, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, maybe 50 feet away. Same height, same build, same old-fashioned pack. He was just standing there in the moonlight, facing my tent. I grabbed my headlamp and pointed it toward him, but the beam seemed to stop short, like the darkness was swallowing the light. "Hey," I called out in a harsh whisper, not wanting to wake the other campers. "What do you want?" The figure didn't move for maybe 10 seconds, then slowly stepped backward into the trees and disappeared. I barely slept the rest of that night. Every sound made me jump. Wind in the leaves, a stick falling, an owl calling. I kept imagining I could feel eyes watching me through the thin nylon of my tent. When morning came, I was exhausted and on edge. But I told myself I was just being paranoid. The trail can play tricks on your mind, especially when you're tired and sleeping in unfamiliar places every night. The next day, I hiked hard, trying to put distance between myself and whatever weirdness had happened at Standing Bear. I made 22 miles, pushing myself until my legs burned and my pack felt like it weighed 100 pounds. I camped at a remote spot near a stream, far from any official campground or shelter. I was completely alone, which should have felt peaceful, but instead made me nervous. I woke up before dawn and immediately knew something was wrong. My food bag, which I'd hung properly in a tree 15 feet from my campsite, was on the ground. Not torn open by bears or raccoons. It was sitting upright next to my tent, exactly as I'd packed it, but with one item missing. A single energy bar, the kind I'd been eating for breakfast every morning. Nothing else was touched. That's when I found the footprints. Boot prints in the soft earth around my campsite, circling my tent in a perfect loop. The stride length and pattern were consistent with someone walking very slowly, very deliberately. The prints came from the direction of the trail, circled my camp 3 times, then headed back the way they'd come. But here's the thing that made my skin crawl. The prints led back to the trail, but they also continued past where I'd camped, heading north on the same route I was planning to take. I broke camp faster than I ever had before and started hiking north as early as possible. But every few miles, at overlooks or trail intersections, I'd catch glimpses of him. Always ahead of me, always watching, always disappearing the moment I tried to get closer. It was like he was scouting my route, staying just far enough ahead to monitor my progress. By the third day, I was starting to lose it. I'd barely slept, was jumping at every sound, and had started hiking with my GPS tracker constantly on, broadcasting my location to my emergency contacts. I tried calling the trail rangers, but my cell service was spotty at best. I did manage to post on a hiking forum using a weak data signal, asking if anyone else had encountered a strange hiker in the area. The responses that came back made my blood run cold. Saw him 2 weeks ago near Mac's Patch. Thought he was following me, but convinced myself I was imagining it. He's been on the trail for at least a month. Always alone, never talks to anyone. I saw him last summer too. Same guy, same pack. How is that possible? That's when I realized this wasn't just some weird hiker. This was something else entirely. The posts described sightings going back years, always the same description. Always the same behavior. One hiker mentioned seeing him appear to be watching a campsite from the woods. But when park rangers investigated, they found no trace of anyone. The breaking point came on day 18. I was approaching Charlie's Bunyan, a popular overlook in the Smokies. It was late afternoon, and I was planning to camp at the next shelter about 5 miles ahead. As I climbed toward the overlook, I saw him again, standing at the viewpoint with his back to the trail. This time, I was determined to confront him. I approached slowly, trying to be non-threatening. "Excuse me," I called out when I was about 20 feet away. "I've been seeing you on the trail for several days. Are you okay? Do you need help?" He turned around slowly, and for the first time, I got a clear look at his face. It was wrong. Not disfigured or obviously inhuman, but wrong in a way that made my brain struggle to process what I was seeing. His features were too symmetrical, too perfect. Like a computer-generated image that falls just short of looking real. His eyes were completely black, no visible iris or pupil, and they reflected light like an animal's. When he smiled, his teeth were too white, too sharp, and there were too many of them. "Blakely," he said, and his voice was my voice. Not similar to my voice, it was exactly my voice, down to the slight North Carolina accent I'd inherited from my grandmother. "You're making good time, right on schedule." I ran. I dropped my trekking poles and ran back down that trail faster than I'd ever moved in my life, my pack bouncing and gear rattling as I fled. Behind me, I could hear laughter. My own laughter, but wrong, like it was coming from a broken recording. I didn't stop running until I reached the next shelter, where I found 3 other hikers setting up for the night. I was gasping, crying, probably looking like I'd lost my mind. They helped me get my gear sorted and gave me hot soup. But when I tried to explain what had happened, I could see the doubt in their eyes. Trail hysteria, they probably thought. Too many miles, not enough sleep. That night, I slept in the shelter with the other hikers, but I still felt exposed. Around midnight, I woke up to see a familiar silhouette standing just outside the shelter, perfectly still in the moonlight. The other hikers were fast asleep, and I didn't want to wake them. I lay there watching that figure for what felt like hours, until finally it stepped back into the darkness. In the morning, I found another energy bar, sitting on the picnic table outside the shelter. The same kind that had been taken from my food bag days earlier. It was placed exactly where I'd been sitting the night before, like it was meant specifically for me. I hiked out with the other 3 that morning, but by noon, I'd made my decision. At the next road crossing, I called for a pickup. I told my trail family I was dealing with a family emergency, that I'd have to finish the trail another year. They were understanding, supportive even. Trail angels are like that. But the truth is, I quit because I knew he'd never stop following me. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human, and it had locked onto me for reasons I couldn't understand. Every instinct I had screamed that if I'd continued north, if I'd let him keep herding me toward whatever destination he had in mind, I wouldn't have made it off that trail alive. I drove straight home to Charlotte and didn't look back. For weeks afterward, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I could see that familiar silhouette standing in my backyard, watching my bedroom window. I started sleeping with all the lights on, stopped going hiking entirely, even avoided being outside after dark. It's been 8 months now, and the fear has faded to a manageable level. But I still follow the hiking forums, still read posts from other AT thru hikers, and sometimes, maybe once a month, someone posts about seeing a strange hiker who doesn't respond to greetings, who watches from a distance, who seems to appear at impossible locations along the trail. Last week, I found a post that made my hands shake. Has anyone else noticed that weird guy with the old external frame pack? Saw him yesterday near trail marker 47. When I tried to approach him, he said my name even though we'd never met. His voice sounded exactly like mine. The post was from a hiker named Sarah, 22 years old, attempting her first thru hike. I sent her a private message warning her to get off the trail, but she never responded. Her last forum post was 3 days ago. Making good time, right on schedule. I keep telling myself there's nothing I can do, that maybe I imagined the whole thing, that trail hysteria is a real phenomenon that affects more hikers than anyone wants to admit. But late at night, when I'm lying in my apartment listening to the city sounds of Charlotte, I sometimes hear something that chills me to the bone. The sound of my own laughter coming from somewhere outside my window, wrong and broken and impossibly far from any trail. My name is Blakely, and I never finished the Appalachian Trail. But something else did. Something that wears hikers' faces and speaks with their voices. Something that's still out there following the next victim north toward whatever terrible destination awaits at the end of the line. My name is Aries, and I spent 38 years as a park ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains. I've seen every kind of weather, tracked every type of wildlife, and rescued more lost hikers than I can count. In all those years, I thought I understood these mountains, their moods, their dangers, their secrets. I was wrong. There are places in the Smokies that are older than human memory, older than the Cherokee who first walked these ridges, older than anything that has a right to exist in our world. What I found in my final year before retirement still haunts me, and it's the reason I moved to Florida the day after I turned in my badge. It started with the missing hikers. In 38 years, I dealt with plenty of search and rescue operations. People get lost, injured. Sometimes they make poor decisions, and nature makes them pay for it. But the disappearances that began in September were different. These weren't inexperienced tourists who wandered off marked trails. These were seasoned hikers, people who knew these mountains as well as I did. The first was Marcus Hoffman, a wildlife photographer who'd been documenting the park for 15 years. He knew every trail, every overlook, every secret waterfall. Marcus was supposed to meet his wife at Cataract Falls after a 3-day solo photography trip. When he didn't show up, she called us. We found his truck at the Chimney Tops trailhead, his itinerary clearly marked on a map in his glove compartment. His plan was straightforward. Hike the established trails, photograph the early fall colors, return by Tuesday evening. We found his campsite on the second day of searching. His tent was properly set up, no signs of struggle, all his gear accounted for except his camera equipment. His sleeping bag was unzipped from the inside, like he'd gotten up in the middle of the night and walked away. The strangest thing was the footprints. His boot prints led away from the camp in a straight line, heading directly into the deepest part of the forest, off any established trail. We followed them for about half a mile before they just stopped, as if he'd simply vanished into thin air. 2 weeks later, it was Jennifer Kim, a botany professor from UT, who'd been studying rare plant species in the park for over a decade. Same story, experienced hiker, detailed itinerary, properly set up camp, and then gone. Her footprints also led away from her campsite in a straight line, heading deeper into the mountains. This time, we brought in search dogs. The dogs followed her scent for about the same distance as we'd tracked Marcus, then started acting strangely. They'd whine, refuse to continue, and try to lead us back the way we'd come. After the third disappearance, a local man named Tom Bradley, who'd been hiking these mountains since he was a child. The Park Service brought in additional resources. We had helicopters with thermal imaging, expert trackers, even some consultants from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Nothing. It was like these people were walking into another dimension. The breakthrough, if you can call it that, came from old Cherokee records. I was working with a tribal elder named Joseph Crow Feather, whose grandfather had been one of the last Cherokee to leave these mountains before the Trail of Tears. Joseph had been helping us understand some of the more remote areas of the park, places that weren't on modern maps but appeared in old tribal stories. "There is a place," he told me one evening as we sat around a campfire, "that our people avoided. A grove of trees that the old ones said were not right, not natural. They called it Enviamadihi, the place where the ancient ones sleep." He pointed toward a section of the park that was marked on our maps as simply wilderness area. No trails, no designated camping spots. My grandfather said those trees were here before the Cherokee, before any people. He said they dreamed, and their dreams were hungry. The next morning, I decided to investigate this grove. I'd been planning to retire in 6 months anyway, and 38 years of service had earned me enough credibility to bend some rules. I told my supervisor I was doing a routine wildlife survey in the backcountry, loaded up my gear, and headed into the wilderness area alone. It took me most of the day to reach the coordinates Joseph had given me. The terrain was rougher than anything I'd encountered in decades of park service. Steep ravines, thick underbrush, fallen logs that seemed to create a natural maze. As I got deeper into the area, I noticed the normal forest sounds were fading. No bird calls, no insect noise. Even the wind seemed muted. I found the grove just before sunset. At first glance, it looked like any other cluster of old-growth trees. But as I got closer, I realized these trees were massive beyond anything I'd seen in the Smokies. Some had trunks that would take 8 or 10 people holding hands to encircle. They were a species I couldn't identify. Not oak, not chestnut, not anything in my field guides. The bark was almost black, with a texture that looked more like skin than wood. The strangest thing was the silence. In 38 years of walking through these forests, I'd never experienced complete silence. There's always something. Leaves rustling, branches creaking, small animals moving through the underbrush. But in this grove, the silence was absolute and unnatural. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was like the trees were actively absorbing sound, swallowing it into themselves. I set up camp about 100 yards from the edge of the grove, close enough to observe but far enough away to feel safe. As night fell, I sat by my small campfire and watched the trees. That's when I first noticed they were moving. Not swaying in the wind. There was no wind. They were moving like they were slowly stretching, repositioning themselves, almost like they were alive, in a way that had nothing to do with being plants. Around midnight, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Voices coming from deep within the grove. Human voices, calling out in distress, pleading for help. I recognized one of them immediately. Marcus Hoffman, the photographer who disappeared weeks earlier. His voice was calling my name, begging me to help him, saying he was lost and couldn't find his way out. Every instinct I'd developed in nearly 4 decades of search and rescue told me to investigate, to help. But something deeper, some primal survival instinct, kept me frozen by my campfire. The voices continued for maybe an hour, sometimes Marcus, sometimes Jennifer Kim, sometimes Tom Bradley. They all sounded terrified, desperate, exactly like people who were lost and in danger. But as the night wore on, I began to notice inconsistencies. The voices were repeating the same phrases, the same pleas for help, like broken recordings. And they were coming from different locations within the grove, as if the speakers were moving around, or as if the grove itself was throwing their voices. Just before dawn, the voices stopped, and I saw something that explained everything. The trees were digesting. That's the only way I can describe it. The massive trunks were pulsing slowly, rhythmically, like enormous stomachs processing a meal. And inside the bark, barely visible in the pre-dawn light, I could see shapes. Human-shaped bulges, moving slowly up the trunks, being absorbed into the trees themselves. I watched in horror as the shapes disappeared into the branches above, and I understood what had happened to the missing hikers. The trees weren't just alive, they were predators. They'd been luring people into the grove, probably for centuries, using the voices of their previous victims as bait. I broke camp and hiked out of there as fast as my 60-year-old legs could carry me. By the time I reached my truck, I'd convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Exhaustion, altitude, maybe some kind of hallucination brought on by stress. But when I got back to the ranger station and checked the missing persons files, I found something that shattered that comfortable delusion. In the park's archives, going back to the 1930s, there were records of disappearances in that same area. Not many, maybe one every few years, but consistent. Experienced hikers, hunters, even a few park rangers over the decades, all vanishing without a trace in the same section of wilderness. And in some of the older reports, there were mentions of searchers hearing voices calling for help from deep in the forest. Voices that led rescue teams in circles before falling silent. I submitted my retirement papers the next day. 38 years of service, and I was walking away 6 months early. But I couldn't stay. I couldn't pretend I hadn't seen what I'd seen, and I couldn't risk anyone else getting hurt because of my silence. I tried to convince my supervisor to close that section of the park, to declare it unsafe for public access. But how do you explain that trees are eating people without sounding insane? Before I left Tennessee, I met with Joseph Crow Feather one last time. I told him what I'd found, and he wasn't surprised. "The old ones knew," he said. "That's why we stayed away, why we warned our children never to go there. Some things are too old, too hungry to be fought. They can only be avoided." I live in a retirement community in Sarasota now, surrounded by palm trees and golf courses, and nothing older than 30 years. But sometimes, usually late at night when the Florida wind is rustling through the palms, I hear voices calling for help. Familiar voices. Marcus, Jennifer, Tom, and sometimes others I don't recognize. They're still out there, still being used as bait by those ancient trees, still trying to lure the next victim into that grove where the hungry dreams wait. My name is Aries, and I spent 38 years protecting people in the Great Smoky Mountains. But there are some places that can't be protected from, some dangers that are older than human understanding. All you can do is stay away and hope that others are smart enough to do the same. But people keep disappearing in that wilderness area. And I know those trees are still feeding, still growing, still dreaming their hungry dreams in the dark heart of the mountains. If you ever find yourself hiking in the Smokies and you hear voices calling for help from deep in the forest, don't follow them. No matter how desperate they sound, no matter how much your conscience tells you to help, just turn around and walk away. Because those aren't people calling for help anymore. They're just echoes, trapped in the belly of something ancient and patient and eternally hungry. My name is Freya, and I'm a 31-year-old true crime podcaster. For the last 5 years, I've been chasing the darkest cases across America. The ones that keep cops awake at night and families waiting by phones that never ring. My podcast, Cold Trail, has covered everything from serial killers to missing persons. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I uncovered in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia last September. What started as research into a decades-old cold case became something that challenges everything I thought I knew about reality itself. The case that brought me to Virginia was the disappearance of Rebecca Marsh, a 23-year-old journalism student who vanished along the Blue Ridge Parkway in 1987. Rebecca had been driving from her college in North Carolina to visit her parents in Maryland when she simply disappeared. Her car was found 3 days later at a scenic overlook. Keys still in the ignition, purse untouched, no signs of struggle. The case went cold almost immediately. No witnesses, no forensic evidence, no leads worth following. What made me take notice of Rebecca's case wasn't the disappearance itself, but a detail buried deep in the police files that I'd obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request. In the weeks following Rebecca's disappearance, park rangers and local law enforcement received multiple reports of strange audio phenomena in the area where her car was found. Hikers claimed their radios and recording equipment would spontaneously activate, picking up conversations that seemed to be coming from nowhere. Most disturbing were the reports that some of these conversations included a young woman's voice calling for help. I arrived in Virginia in early September, planning to spend a week interviewing locals and retracing Rebecca's last known movements. I'd brought my usual equipment, digital recorders, backup batteries, portable microphones, everything I needed to document whatever I might find. I had no idea that the mountains themselves would become part of my investigation. My first stop was the Park Service office, where I met with Ranger Patricia Collins, who'd been working the Blue Ridge Parkway for over 30 years. Patricia was hesitant to talk about the audio phenomena at first, clearly worried about sounding unprofessional. But when I mentioned I was a podcaster, not a journalist looking to sensationalize things, she opened up. "It's been happening for decades," Patricia told me, her voice low as if she was afraid the mountains might hear her. "Not just since Rebecca disappeared, long before that. Rangers have reported equipment malfunctions, strange voices on radio channels that should be empty, recordings that capture conversations from God knows where. We've had acoustic engineers come out here, EMF specialists, even some folks from the university who study atmospheric phenomena. Nobody can explain it." She showed me a file folder thick with incident reports dating back to the 1970s. Report after report described the same types of events. Electronic devices turning on by themselves, voices speaking on dead radio frequencies, recordings that captured conversations between people who weren't there. What made my blood run cold was reading report after report that mentioned a young woman's voice specifically. always asking for help, always sounding desperate, always cutting out just when rangers tried to respond. That afternoon, I drove to the overlook where Rebecca's car had been found. It's a beautiful spot, about 4,000 feet up, with sweeping views of the valley below. There's a small parking area and a short trail that leads to a wooden observation platform. Standing there, looking out over the endless green hills, I could understand why someone might stop to take in the view. I could also understand how isolated and vulnerable they might feel. I set up my recording equipment and began documenting my impressions of the location. That's when it started. About 10 minutes into my recording session, my digital recorder began picking up something that shouldn't have been there. A conversation between two people, their voices faint but clearly audible through my headphones. "I told you we should have stayed on the main road. Getting dark, and I think we're lost." The voices were coming through clearly, but there was no one else in the area. I was completely alone. I checked all my equipment. Everything was functioning normally. No radio interference, no external signals that could account for what I was hearing. The conversation continued for maybe 3 minutes. Two people discussing being lost, needing to find help, getting increasingly worried as darkness approached. Then it just stopped. I played back the recording immediately. The voices were there, clear as day, recorded along with my own voice and the ambient sounds of the overlook. But according to my visual scan of the area and my own observations, I'd been completely alone during that entire 10-minute period. That night, I stayed at a motel in a nearby town and spent hours researching atmospheric conditions, radio propagation, anything that might explain how my equipment could pick up conversations from sources I couldn't identify. I found a few possible explanations: atmospheric reflection of distant radio signals, interference from cell phone towers, even the possibility that my equipment was somehow picking up old radio broadcasts. But none of those explanations felt right. The voices had sounded too immediate, too present. The next day, I returned to the overlook with additional equipment: multiple recorders, a spectrum analyzer to monitor radio frequencies, even a basic EMF detector I'd borrowed from a local paranormal investigation group. I felt ridiculous carrying all that gear, but I needed to document whatever was happening as thoroughly as possible. The phenomena started almost immediately. Within 15 minutes of setting up my equipment, I began picking up voice fragments again, but this time was different. This time, one of the voices sounded familiar. "Please, if anyone can hear this, I'm Rebecca Marsh. My car broke down near mile marker 2 on 13. I nearly dropped my recorder. The voice was young, female, desperate, and she'd just identified herself as Rebecca Marsh, the woman who'd disappeared 36 years earlier. I fumbled for my backup recorder, making sure I was capturing everything on multiple devices. I tried to walk for help, but I got turned around in the woods. It's getting cold, and I can't find my way back to the road." The voice continued for nearly 5 minutes, describing being lost, being frightened, asking for help. The details she gave matched perfectly with the weather conditions and time of year when Rebecca had disappeared. She mentioned specific landmarks that appeared on topographical maps of the area but weren't visible from the overlook itself. When the voice finally faded, I was shaking. I immediately called Patricia Collins, but I couldn't reach her. I left a voicemail asking her to meet me at the overlook as soon as possible, that I'd captured something she needed to hear. While waiting for Patricia to call back, I decided to explore the area more thoroughly. The voice had mentioned walking into the woods, getting lost trying to find help. There was a hiking trail that led down from the overlook into the valley below. I gathered my equipment and started down the trail, stopping every few hundred yards to set up my recorders and monitor for additional phenomena. About a mile down the trail, my equipment started going crazy. All three of my digital recorders began picking up signals simultaneously, their LED meters jumping as they captured audio from multiple sources. But this time, it wasn't just Rebecca's voice. I was hearing conversations between multiple people, some sounding contemporary, others with speech patterns and references that seemed to be from different decades entirely. Haven't seen her since yesterday morning. Search teams are covering the northern section. Found some footprints leading away from the road. I realized I was listening to fragments of the search efforts that had taken place after Rebecca's disappearance. Voices of law enforcement officers, park rangers, volunteer searchers, all talking about looking for her, all recorded by equipment that shouldn't have been able to capture signals from 36 years ago. Then I heard something that made me understand I was in danger. Among all the historical voices, I heard one that was clearly contemporary. A man's voice, speaking in present tense. She's down here now, just like the other one was, following the same path, asking the same questions. The other one, he was talking about Rebecca, and he was talking about me. I grabbed my equipment and started hiking back up the trail as fast as I could move. But as I climbed, the voices in my headphones became more intense, more immediate. I was hearing real-time commentary on my movements. Moving back toward the road now, carrying recording equipment just like before. She won't make it back either. I was being watched, tracked, and somehow the mountains themselves were recording it all. When I finally reached my car, I was gasping for breath and completely terrified. I threw my equipment in the back seat and drove straight back to the motel, not stopping until I was locked in my room with every light turned on. That night, I reviewed all my recordings. Hours of audio that documented conversations spanning decades, all seemingly taking place in the same location where Rebecca Marsh had disappeared. The technical quality was perfect. No distortion, no signs of electronic manipulation, voices clear and distinct. But the content was impossible. I was listening to the past. Somehow, the Blue Ridge Mountains were preserving sounds, conversations, entire events, and replaying them for anyone with the right equipment to hear. Rebecca's desperate calls for help, the search efforts that followed her disappearance, and now my own investigation. All of it was being recorded and stored in some way I couldn't begin to understand. The next morning, I packed my equipment and prepared to leave Virginia. But as I was loading my car, my phone rang. It was Patricia Collins. "Freya, thank God I reached you. We found something. Yesterday afternoon, about the time you left that voicemail, some hikers found human remains about 2 miles down the trail from the overlook. Preliminary examination suggests they've been there for decades." My hands started shaking. "Have you identified them?" "Not yet, but..." Patricia paused. "They found them with a purse. Driver's license inside belonged to Rebecca Marsh." I drove back to the overlook one final time. The recovery team was still working, carefully excavating what remained of Rebecca after 36 years in the mountains. As I watched them work, I realized the voices I'd been hearing weren't some supernatural phenomenon. They were evidence. Somehow, the unique acoustic properties of this location, combined with atmospheric conditions I didn't understand, had preserved audio from the past. Rebecca had made it much further than anyone realized. She'd survived long enough to call for help, to leave a trail of voice recordings that had been echoing through these mountains for over 3 decades, waiting for someone with the right equipment to hear them. But there was something else. As the recovery team worked, my recorder, which I'd left running in my car, picked up one final transmission. Rebecca's voice, clearer than ever before. "Thank you for finding me. Thank you for not giving up." I produced a 3-part podcast series about the Blue Ridge phenomena, Rebecca's case, and the scientific implications of what I'd discovered. The series won a Peabody Award and led to renewed interest in acoustic research in mountainous regions. Several other cold cases have been reopened based on similar audio phenomena reported in various locations. But I never went back to the Blue Ridge Mountains, because in all those hours of recordings I captured, there was one voice I never mentioned in my podcast. One conversation that I've never shared with anyone. My own voice, recorded by equipment I wasn't operating. Having a conversation I don't remember having. She found Rebecca, just like we knew she would. But now she knows too much. The mountains keep their secrets. My name is Freya, and I solved a 36-year-old cold case by listening to voices from the past. But in doing so, I may have become part of the next mystery for someone else to solve. Because the Blue Ridge Mountains are still recording, still preserving every sound, every conversation, every secret. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if my own voice is now part of that eternal echo, waiting for the next investigator to come looking for answers they might not want to find. My name is Bryce, and I'm a 52-year-old bow hunter who's been stalking these Allegheny Mountains in West Virginia for over 30 years. My daddy taught me to hunt when I was 8 years old, and his daddy before him made these same ridges and hollows his second home. Hunting isn't just what I do, it's who I am. I know every deer trail, every water source, every wind pattern in a 40-square-mile area around my cabin. At least, I thought I did until last October, when something started hunting me back. The morning it all began was perfect for bow season. October 15th, crisp and clear, with just enough wind to cover the sound of my movement through the woods. I'd been tracking a big buck for 3 weeks, a 12-pointer I'd nicknamed Scarface because of an old wound across his snout. I'd seen him twice from a distance, but he was smart, experienced, the kind of deer that makes or breaks a hunting season. I was set up in my tree stand before dawn, 20 feet up an old white oak that overlooks a natural funnel between 2 ridges. It's a spot that's been in my family for generations. My grandfather built the original platform there in 1962, and I've been maintaining and improving it ever since. From that perch, I can see for maybe 200 yards in every direction, and any deer moving between the ridges has to pass within bow range. The sun came up slow and orange, burning off the morning mist and revealing the forest floor below me. I'd been sitting motionless for about 2 hours when I first heard it, a sound that didn't belong in these woods. It was a low whistle, almost musical, coming from somewhere behind me. Not a bird call or wind through the trees, but something deliberate, something that seemed to be trying to get my attention. I turned as carefully as I could, trying not to make any noise that might spook nearby game. The whistle came again, closer this time, and with it came something that made the hair on my neck stand up. It sounded like my grandfather's whistle, the 3-note call he used to use when we hunted together, the signal that meant, "Come here, I found something." But my grandfather had been dead for 15 years. I convinced myself it was just another hunter, maybe someone who'd learned that same whistle from their own family. These mountains have a way of preserving old traditions, passing them down through generations of hunters and woodsmen. But something about the sound felt wrong, too perfect, like a recording being played back rather than a living person making the call. The whistle came a third time, and this time I could tell it was moving. Whatever was making that sound was circling my position, staying just out of sight but close enough that I could track its movement through the forest. That's when I realized something was very wrong. I'd been hunting these woods for 3 decades, and I could identify the footstep pattern of every animal that lived here. Deer have a particular rhythm. Bears shuffle, turkeys scratch and pause. But whatever was moving through the underbrush below me was walking like a human while trying to sound like an animal. I reached for my binoculars and started scanning the forest floor. The movement stopped immediately, as if whatever was down there knew I was looking for it. The woods went completely silent. No bird calls, no squirrel chatter, no insects buzzing. In 30 years of hunting, I'd never experienced that kind of absolute silence. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. Then I saw it. About 50 yards to my north, standing perfectly still behind a large maple tree, was a figure in hunting clothes. At first glance, it looked like any other bow hunter. Camouflage jacket, face mask, compound bow. But something about its posture was wrong. It was too still, too perfectly balanced, like a mannequin someone had positioned in the woods. And it was staring directly at my tree stand. I raised my binoculars for a better look. And that's when I saw the eyes. Even through the face mask, even at that distance, I could see eyes that reflected light, like an animal's. Not the normal reflection you might get from glasses or moisture, but the bright, unnatural shine of a nocturnal predator. Those eyes were locked on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Hey there, you okay?" The figure didn't respond, didn't move, didn't even seem to acknowledge that I'd spoken. It just kept staring, those impossible eyes never blinking, never shifting focus. That's when it started copying me. When I moved my head to the left, it moved its head to the left. When I raised my hand, it raised its hand. When I reached for my bow, it reached for its bow. The movements were perfectly synchronized, like I was looking into a mirror. But the timing was just slightly off, maybe a half-second delay, like whatever was down there was watching me, and then mimicking my actions. I decided to get down from my stand. 30 years of hunting had taught me to trust my instincts, and every instinct I had was screaming that I needed to get out of those woods. I started my descent slowly, keeping one eye on the figure below me. It continued to mirror my movements, crouching when I crouched, reaching for handholds when I reached for handholds. When my feet hit the ground, the figure stood up straight. That's when I realized it was wearing my clothes. Not similar clothes, the exact same camouflage pattern, the same brand of boots, even the same orange safety vest that I'd put on that morning. It was like looking at a perfect duplicate of myself. Right down to the tear in my jacket sleeve that I'd gotten from barbed wire the week before. The thing started walking toward me, and I could see that it moved wrong. The gait was too smooth, too fluid, like it was gliding across the forest floor rather than walking. Each step was perfectly silent, not disturbing so much as a single leaf on the ground. As it got closer, I could see more details that made my blood run cold. Its face, visible now through the mesh of the mask, was my face. Not similar to my face, not a close resemblance. It was exactly my face, down to the scar on my chin from a childhood accident and the crooked nose I'd gotten in a bar fight 20 years ago. But the eyes were wrong. Too bright, too knowing, like they belonged to something ancient, wearing my face as a disguise. When it spoke, it used my voice. "Beautiful morning for hunting, Bryce." The words were perfectly articulated, The accent exactly right. But there was something underneath the voice. Something cold and hungry that didn't belong in human speech. I backed away, my bow ready, but knowing somehow that shooting this thing wouldn't help me. It continued to advance at the same steady pace, never hurrying, never slowing down, just maintaining that constant, predatory approach. "You've been coming to these woods for 30 years, it said in my voice. "Your grandfather before you, his father before him. 3 generations of hunters, all using the same trails, the same stands, the same calls." It tilted its head, studying me like I was an interesting specimen. "But you never learned the most important rule about hunting in these mountains." "What rule?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "Sometimes you're not the hunter." Its smile was my smile, but wrong, too wide, showing too many teeth. "Sometimes you're just bait." That's when I realized what had been happening. For weeks, I've been tracking Scarface, learning his patterns, figuring out where he fed and where he bedded down. But something else had been tracking me, learning my patterns, figuring out where I hunted and when I'd be alone in the woods. I'd been so focused on hunting the deer that I hadn't noticed I was being hunted. I ran. 30 years of navigating these mountains paid off as I crashed through the underbrush, following deer trails and old logging roads I knew by heart. Behind me, I could hear my own voice calling out, sometimes laughing, sometimes making that familiar whistle my grandfather had taught me. The sounds seemed to come from all directions, like there were multiple copies of me scattered through the forest. I made it back to my truck, fumbling with the keys as I heard my own footsteps approaching through the trees. I started the engine and drove down that mountain road faster than I'd ever driven before, not slowing down until I reached the main highway. That was 3 months ago, and I haven't been back to those woods since. But the thing that wore my face hasn't forgotten about me. I found footprints in the mud around my cabin, footprints that match my own boots exactly. I've heard my grandfather's whistle outside my bedroom window at night, always coming from a different direction, always just out of sight when I look. Last week, I found a deer carcass in my front yard, killed with a bow shot that was placed exactly where I would have placed it. Pinned to the deer with one of my own arrows was a note written in my handwriting. "Thanks for the lesson, Bryce. Your turn to be hunted. The local game warden thinks I'm having some kind of breakdown, stress from too many years alone in the woods. My few remaining hunting buddies think I'm making the whole thing up for attention. But I know what I saw, what I experienced. Something in those Allegheny Mountains has been watching human hunters for generations, learning from us, copying us, becoming us. I've been carrying a gun everywhere now, even though I know bullets won't stop whatever that thing is. I've installed motion sensors around my property, security cameras, even hired a private investigator to look into similar incidents in the area. What he found terrifies me more than anything else. Going back to the 1800s, there are reports from hunters and trappers about encounters with mirror men in these mountains. People who met perfect duplicates of themselves in the woods. Duplicates that seemed to know everything they knew, hunt the way they hunted, even speak to their families and friends in their voice. Most of these reports were dismissed as tall tales or the effects of isolation and alcohol. But the investigator found patterns, consistencies across more than a century of accounts. The thing that's been copying me isn't unique. It's part of something larger. Something that's been using these mountains as hunting grounds for longer than anyone realizes. And now it knows everything I know about hunting, tracking, surviving in the wilderness. It's learned my skills and added them to whatever unnatural abilities it already possessed. My name is Bryce, and for 30 years I thought I was a predator in the Allegheny Mountains. But I was wrong. I was prey, carefully studied and cataloged by something that's been perfecting the art of hunting humans for over a century. And now that it's learned everything it can from me, I have the horrible feeling that my usefulness as a teacher is coming to an end. If you're a hunter in these mountains, if you've been following the same patterns and using the same stands for years, pay attention to the signs. If you hear your own voice calling from the woods, if you see your own face watching you from the trees, if you find evidence of someone copying your techniques, get out. Get out immediately and don't come back. Because something is still out there, wearing the faces and voices of hunters who came before, waiting patiently for the next student to teach it how to be an even better predator. And the final lesson it wants to learn is how to take your place permanently, leaving you lost forever in woods that know your name but will never let you go home. My name is Piper, and I spent the first 18 years of my life in the mountains of eastern Kentucky before escaping to college in Louisville and then a job in Cincinnati. For 11 years, I built a life in the city. Corporate marketing job, downtown apartment, friends who knew nothing about where I came from. I thought I'd successfully left my family's mountain traditions behind forever. But when my grandmother passed away last March, I had to go back to those hollers for her funeral. Back to family I hadn't seen in over a decade. What I discovered there made me understand why I'd been so desperate to leave, and why some things refuse to stay buried, no matter how far you run. I got the call about Grandma Essie's death on a Tuesday morning from my cousin Raylan, who I hadn't spoken to since high school graduation. His voice sounded older, rougher around the edges, but the mountain accent was still thick as molasses. "Piper, honey, you need to come home. Grandma passed in her sleep Sunday night. Funeral's gonna be Friday at the old church." The way he said "need" made it clear this wasn't really a request. In our family, certain obligations couldn't be ignored, even by those of us who'd fled to more civilized places. The drive back to Pike County took me through increasingly familiar and unwelcome territory. The highways gave way to two-lane roads, then to winding mountain routes that carved through hollers I recognized from childhood. Every mile took me further from the life I'd built and deeper into memories I'd spent years trying to forget. By the time I reached the turnoff to our family hollow, my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. The family homestead hadn't changed much in 11 years. The same collection of trailers, double wides, and one original log cabin clustered around what had once been a working farm. Kids I didn't recognize played in yards filled with old cars and farm equipment. Dogs barked as my rental car crunched up the gravel driveway. But what struck me most was the silence underneath all that normal activity. A watchful quiet that seemed to press against my eardrums. My cousin Raylan met me at what everyone still called the big house. Though it was really just a double wide that had been added onto so many times, it looked like something from a fever dream. He was thinner than I remembered, his face gaunt in a way that spoke of more than just grief. When he hugged me, I could feel his ribs through his shirt, and his breath smelled like something had died in his mouth. "Family's been gathering since yesterday," he told me as he walked me toward the house. "Most everyone's here now. Been waiting for you before we started the proper morning." The way he emphasized proper sent a chill down my spine. I'd grown up hearing whispers about the old ways our family practiced, traditions that went back generations. But I'd always assumed they were just mountain superstitions that would die out with the older generation. Inside the house, the living room was packed with relatives I barely remembered. Aunts and uncles and cousins twice removed, all dressed in black, all watching me with expressions that ranged from curiosity to something that looked almost like hunger. Grandma Essie's casket sat in the center of the room. surrounded by flowers that had been arranged in patterns I didn't recognize, but that made my skin crawl for reasons I couldn't explain. My great-aunt Loretta, who had to be pushing 90, grabbed my arm with fingers like iron claws. "Look who's come home," she announced to the room, her voice carrying a satisfaction that made me want to run. The prodigal daughter, back for the binding. I asked her what she meant by binding, but she just smiled with teeth too white and too sharp for someone her age. The viewing went on for hours, with relatives I'd forgotten existed telling stories about Grandma Essie that painted her as some kind of mountain-wise woman. They talked about her healing touch, her ability to find lost things, her knowledge of plants and roots that could cure any ailment. What disturbed me was the way they kept looking at me while they talked, as if they were waiting for some kind of recognition or acknowledgement that never came. As evening approached, the crowd began to thin out, but the core family remained. That's when Uncle Jeremiah, Grandma's oldest son, announced that it was time for the family circle. They rearranged the furniture, moving Grandma's casket to one side and forming a circle of chairs in the center of the room. Everyone took a seat except for me, standing awkwardly in the doorway, feeling like I'd walked into something I didn't understand. "Sit down, Piper," Uncle Jeremiah commanded, pointing to an empty chair that seemed to be positioned directly across from where he sat. "Time you learned what you've been chosen for." The word chosen hit me like a physical blow. I'd heard that word whispered about me when I was a child, always in contexts that made the adults stop talking when they noticed I was listening. I remained standing. "I don't know what this is about, but I just came for Grandma's funeral. I'm flying back to Cincinnati Sunday morning." My voice sounded small and uncertain in that room full of relatives who suddenly felt more like strangers. Uncle Jeremiah's expression hardened. "You can't run from what you are, girl. What's in the blood don't get diluted by city living. Essie chose you before you were even born, and her death don't change that. If anything, it makes it more binding." He gestured to the casket. "She's been keeping the family gifts alive for 60 years, but she's gone now. Power like that don't just disappear. It passes on to the next chosen one." That's when I noticed that everyone in the circle was holding something in their hands. Not flowers or prayer books, but objects I couldn't identify in the dim light. Carved bones, bundles of dried herbs, stones that seemed to gleam with their own inner light. The smell in the room was changing too, becoming thick and cloying, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. My cousin Raylin, sitting to Uncle Jeremiah's right, held up what looked like a photograph. But as my eyes adjusted to the light, I realized it wasn't a photograph at all. It was a piece of what looked like human skin, with an image burned or tattooed into it. An image of me as a child, maybe 6 years old, but with eyes that looked ancient, knowing. "Grandma started preparing for this the day you were born," Raylin said, his voice taking on a sing-song quality that reminded me of childhood lullabies. 29 years she's been saving pieces of you, keeping your essence alive in the family bonds. Hair from your first haircut, baby teeth you lost, nail clippings, even skin cells from that time you got so sick with fever. I backed toward the door, but found my way blocked by cousins who'd moved behind me without my noticing. "This is insane," I whispered. But even as I said it, I was remembering things from my childhood that I'd forced myself to forget. The way Grandma Essie always seemed to know when I was lying, how she could find lost objects by closing her eyes and holding something that belonged to the person who'd lost them. The strange dreams I'd had as a child about floating above the hollow and seeing everything that happened in every house. "The gifts run strong in you, Piper," Uncle Jeremiah continued. "Stronger than they ever ran in Essie, stronger than they've run in our family for generations. You think it was coincidence that you did so well in school, got that scholarship, made such a success of yourself in the city? That was the power working through you, even when you were fighting against it. My great-aunt Loretta stood up from her chair, moving with a fluidity that belied her age. In her hands was a clay jar that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Essie's been collecting the family's pain, their sickness, their bad luck for decades, keeping it contained so it don't spread to the rest of us. But that jar's getting full, and it needs someone with a gift to tend it. She held the jar toward me, and I could see that the clay was actually moving, writhing like it was alive. This is what we do, child. This is what the family's always done. We take the darkness so others don't have to carry it. We bear the weight so the community can thrive. I finally understood what they wanted from me, and the realization hit me like a physical blow. They didn't just want me to come home. They wanted me to become the new family keeper, the one who absorbed everyone else's misfortune and pain so they could live normal lives. They wanted me to give up everything I'd built to become a human sacrifice for their collective well-being. I won't do it, I said, surprised by the strength in my own voice. Whatever this is, whatever Grandma agreed to, I didn't choose it. I won't be your scapegoat. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably. The objects in everyone's hands began to glow brighter, and I could hear something like whispers coming from Grandma Essie's casket. Uncle Jeremiah's eyes were completely black now, reflecting the light like an animal's. "You think you have a choice?" he asked, and his voice was layered with something that wasn't entirely human. "You think you can just walk away from blood obligations that go back 7 generations? The choosing was done before you were born, girl. All that's left is the accepting." That's when the pain started. It began in my chest, a crushing weight that made it hard to breathe, then spread through my whole body like liquid fire. I could feel every ache, every sorrow, every moment of suffering that my family had experienced over generations. I was drowning in their collective pain, and I understood that this was what Grandma Essie had carried alone for 60 years. But instead of accepting it, I got angry. Angrier than I'd ever been in my life. I thought about the life I'd built, the person I'd become despite growing up in this hollow, the future I'd planned that had nothing to do with mountain magic and family obligations. I focused on that anger and used it to push back against the pain, to reject what they were trying to force on me. The jar in my great-aunt Loretta's hands cracked. A thin black line appeared down its side, and something that looked like smoke began to leak out. The whispers from Grandma's casket became screams. Every light in the house flickered and went out. In the darkness, I ran. I crashed through the circle of relatives, shoved past my cousins blocking the door, and made it to my rental car. Behind me, I could hear voices calling my name. But they weren't human voices anymore. They were something older, hungrier, and they were promising that I could never truly escape what I was born to be. I drove through the mountains in darkness, not stopping until I reached the interstate. By the time I got back to Cincinnati, I'd convinced myself that the whole experience had been some kind of stress-induced breakdown, a psychological reaction to returning to a place I'd been so desperate to leave. But that was 6 months ago, and strange things have been happening ever since. I'll be walking down the street and suddenly double over with chest pains that aren't mine. I'll wake up in the middle of the night speaking words in a language I don't recognize. Sometimes I'll catch my reflection in a mirror, and for just a moment, my eyes look completely black. Last week, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, It was my great-aunt Loretta's voice, but she was speaking from what sounded like a great distance. "The jar's broken, child," she whispered. "All that pain we kept contained for generations is loose now, spreading through the family, spreading through the community. People are getting sick, losing their jobs, their homes, their minds. You have to come back. You have to fix what you broke." I hung up and immediately blocked the number. But I know it won't matter. Because late at night, when the city is quiet, I can hear them calling to me from across the mountains. And I can feel their pain, their desperation, their need for someone to carry the weight they can no longer bear. My name is Piper, and I thought I could escape my family's mountain traditions by running away to the city. But some obligations follow you no matter how far you go, and some gifts can't be refused forever. They're still waiting for me in that hollow, still holding their circle, still believing that I'll eventually come home and accept what I was born to do. The worst part is, I'm starting to think they might be right. My name is Maximiliano, and I've been a 911 operator for 12 years at the Emergency Dispatch Center serving the remote mountain communities of the Pocono Mountains in Pennsylvania. In 12 years, I've handled everything. Heart attacks, house fires, domestic violence calls, hikers lost in the wilderness. I pride myself on staying calm under pressure, following protocols, and helping people in their worst moments. But what happened during my night shift last November broke every rule I thought governed reality and made me question everything I believed about time, death, and the nature of emergency response. The dispatch center is a converted ranger station about 15 miles outside of Stroudsburg, built in the 1970s and updated with modern equipment over the years. It's a small operation, usually just 2 dispatchers on duty at any given time, covering a huge area of state forest, rural communities, and isolated mountain properties. During the day shift, we stay busy with routine calls, but the night shift can go hours without hearing from anyone. That November night, I was working alone because my partner had called in sick, and the silence felt heavier than usual. The first call came in at 11:47 p.m. The caller ID showed a local number, area code 570, which covers most of our service area. I answered with my standard greeting, "911? What's your emergency?" The voice that responded was that of a young woman, maybe 25 years old, and she sounded terrified. "Please, I need help," she said, her voice shaking. "My name is Jennifer Chen, and I'm lost in the woods near Lake Wallenpaupack. My car broke down, and I tried to walk for help, but I can't find the road anymore. It's getting really cold, and I don't have a jacket." I immediately went into emergency protocol mode, pulling up my mapping software and preparing to coordinate a search and rescue operation. "Jennifer, I need you to stay calm. Can you see any landmarks? Any signs or structures that might help us locate you?" "There's an old hunting cabin about 50 yards from where I'm standing," she replied. "It looks abandoned, but there's a sign on the door that says, 'Whitman property, no trespassing.' The trees around here are mostly pine, and I can hear water running nearby, like a stream." I was typing her information into our system when something made me stop. The description she was giving me was familiar, too familiar. 2 years earlier, I'd handled a nearly identical call from that same area. A young woman named Jennifer Chen had called 911, reporting that she was lost in the woods near Lake Wallenpaupack after her car broke down. We'd dispatched search teams, but they never found her. Her car was eventually located on a back road about 3 miles from where she'd described being, but there was never any trace of Jennifer herself. Jennifer, I said carefully, what year is it? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. What kind of question is that? It's 2022, November 15th, 2022. Why are you asking me that? My hand started shaking as I checked the date on my computer screen. November 15th, 2024. I was talking to someone who thought it was 2 years in the past. Someone who, according to our records, had disappeared without a trace. Jennifer, I need you to listen to me very carefully, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Can you tell me what kind of car you drive? What's the license plate number? She gave me the information, and it matched exactly what was in our missing persons file from 2022. Every detail was identical: her name, her voice, even the description of the abandoned hunting cabin. I was either experiencing an elaborate hoax, or I was somehow receiving a phone call from the past. I'm dispatching search and rescue teams to your location, I told her, which was true. Even if this was impossible, even if Jennifer Chen had been missing for 2 years, I had to follow protocol. I need you to stay where you are and keep your phone on. Signal flares if you have them. Make noise if you hear searchers approaching. Thank you, she said, and I could hear relief in her voice. I was so scared no one would answer. My battery is getting low, but I'll keep the phone on as long as I can. The call ended, and I immediately contacted the state police and local search and rescue volunteers. I gave them the same coordinates where we'd searched unsuccessfully 2 years earlier. But I didn't mention the impossible timing of the call. How could I explain that I was sending them to look for someone who'd been missing for 2 years, but claimed it was 2022? 20 minutes later, my phone rang again. Same number, same voice. But this time, Jennifer sounded different, older, more tired. Please, someone help me, she said. My name is Jennifer Chen, and I've been lost in these woods for days. I can't find my way out, and I'm getting weaker. There's an old hunting cabin here, but it's locked, and I can't get inside. Jennifer, this is the same dispatcher you spoke with earlier tonight, I said. Don't you remember talking to me about 20 minutes ago? 20 minutes ago? Her voice was confused, almost dreamy. No, that can't be right. I've been trying to call for help for 3 days, but I keep getting a busy signal or no signal at all. This is the first time anyone has answered. I checked my call log. According to my system, her previous call had lasted 8 minutes and ended at 12:05 a.m. It was now 12:27 a.m. But Jennifer was insisting she'd been trying to call for 3 days. What year do you think it is, Jennifer? I asked again. 2023, she replied without hesitation. November 15th, 2023. I know because it's my birthday. I was driving to my parents' house for my birthday dinner when my car broke down. This time she thought it was 2023, 1 year in the past. But the date was still November 15th, exactly 1 year after her first call and 1 year before the current date. I realized I was receiving phone calls from Jennifer Chen at different points in her disappearance, as if she was somehow calling through time itself. Over the next 4 hours, my phone rang 7 more times. Each call was from Jennifer, each time from a different point in her experience of being lost. Sometimes she sounded like she'd just gotten lost. Sometimes she claimed to have been wandering for weeks. The year she gave me changed with each call. But the date was always November 15th, 2022, 2021, 2020, going backward in time with each conversation. With each call, Jennifer sounded more desperate, more confused, and somehow less solid, as if she was fading away even as I talked to her. By the 4th call, she was claiming it was 2019, and she'd been lost for months. By the 7th call, she thought it was 2017, and her voice had an echo to it. like she was calling from the bottom of a well. The search teams I dispatched found nothing. They covered the area around the Whitman cabin thoroughly, using heat sensors and search dogs, but there was no trace of Jennifer or any signs that anyone had been there recently. The old hunting cabin was exactly as it had been found 2 years earlier, locked, undisturbed, with no footprints or other evidence around it. The final call came at 4:43 a.m. When I answered, Jennifer's voice was barely a whisper. "I don't think I'm lost anymore," she said. "I think I'm something else. I keep trying to find my way out, but the woods keep changing around me. The trees move when I'm not looking, and the paths lead in circles. I think I died, but I don't know when." "Jennifer, where are you calling from?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "I don't know," she whispered. "I've been walking for so long. Years, maybe. The cabin is always there when I need to rest, but it's never the same cabin. Sometimes it's new, sometimes it's falling apart. Sometimes there are other people inside, but they can't see me." "What year do you think it is now?" I asked. There was a long pause, filled with static that sounded almost like wind through pine trees. "I don't think years matter where I am," she finally said. "Time moves differently here. I call for help, and sometimes someone answers from the future, sometimes from the past. But no one can ever find me because I'm not really lost. I'm just stuck." The line went dead. And when I tried to call the number back, I got a message saying it was no longer in service. I spent the rest of my shift documenting everything that had happened, though I knew no one would believe it. How do you write a report explaining that you received multiple calls from someone who disappeared 2 years ago, claiming to be calling from different points in the past? How do you explain that search teams found nothing because the person calling for help exists in some pocket of time that doesn't line up with our own? I've had 3 other calls like this since that night. Always lost hikers, always people who disappeared in our service area during previous years, always calling from dates in the past, but reaching me in the present. There's something in these Pocono Mountains that traps people, that keeps them cycling through the same emergency over and over again, calling for help across time but never able to be rescued. The worst part is that I keep taking the calls, keep dispatching search teams, keep following protocols, even though I know it's useless. Because what if I'm wrong? What if one of these calls is real, happening in real time, and I could actually save someone? But late at night, when the dispatch center is quiet and the mountains press close around our little building, I sometimes wonder if I'm trapped too. If maybe I died years ago during some routine emergency call, and I'm just replaying the same night shift over and over, answering calls from people who are just as lost in time as I am. My name is Maximiliano, and I'm a 911 operator who takes calls from the past. Every night, people who disappeared years ago reach across time to ask for help I can never give them. And every morning, I wonder if tomorrow I'll be the one calling for help from a time that no longer exists, speaking to a dispatcher who exists in a future I'll never see. The mountains keep their secrets, but sometimes those secrets call 911, and all I can do is listen to voices from the past and dispatch rescue teams to search for ghosts. My name is Valeria, and I'm 19 years old, a sophomore at Georgia State University, studying history and genealogy. I've always been fascinated by my family's past, especially the stories my grandmother used to tell about our ancestors, who lived deep in the North Georgia mountains. When my American history professor assigned us a semester project on family genealogy, I thought it would be the perfect opportunity to trace my family's roots back to their original mountain settlement. What I discovered in those ruins changed not only my understanding of my family's history, but my understanding of time itself. My great-great-grandmother, Elena Vasquez, had immigrated from Spain to the Georgia mountains in 1889, part of a small group of families who established a community they called Valle de los Susurros, Valley of Whispers. According to family stories passed down through generations, the settlement had thrived for about 30 years before being mysteriously abandoned in the early 1920s. My grandmother always claimed that Elena had possessed a gift, an ability to see things that others couldn't, and that this gift had been passed down through the women in our family, though it had grown weaker with each generation. I'd never experienced anything that could be called supernatural. But I'd always felt drawn to genealogy and family history in a way that my friends found obsessive. I could spend hours poring over old documents, census records, and historical maps, feeling an almost physical connection to the past. When I started researching Valle de los Susurros for my project, that connection became stronger than ever. The settlement was difficult to locate on modern maps. The area had been absorbed into the Chattahoochee National Forest decades ago, and most of the old roads had grown over or been reclaimed by the forest. But I found references to it in county records, old newspaper articles, and most helpfully, in the diary of a traveling preacher who had visited the settlement in 1919. His description of the location was detailed enough that I was able to identify the general area on topographical maps. I convinced my roommate Maria to drive up there with me on a Saturday in October. The drive took us deep into the mountains on increasingly narrow roads until we reached what I believed was the turnoff to the old settlement. The paved road ended about a mile before we reached the coordinates I'd calculated. So we had to hike the rest of the way through dense forest that showed no signs of recent human activity. We found the ruins about 2 hours after starting our hike. What had once been a community of maybe 20 families was now just scattered foundations, collapsed chimneys, and the occasional rusted piece of farm equipment half buried in fallen leaves. But even in ruins, I could see the layout of the settlement, the way the houses had been arranged around a central area that had probably been a common space, the remains of what looked like a small church or meeting hall, the stone foundations of what might have been a mill near a stream that still ran clear and cold through the valley. Standing in what had been the center of my family's mountain community, I felt an overwhelming sense of connection, of homecoming. This was where my bloodline had put down roots in American soil, where my ancestors had built their new lives after leaving everything behind in Spain. Maria was taking pictures and exploring the ruins with academic interest. But for me, being there felt like stepping back in time. That's when I first heard the voices. Faint at first, like conversation carried on a distant wind, but definitely human. Spanish voices, speaking in an accent and dialect I recognized from my grandmother's stories about Elena. Maria didn't seem to hear anything, but I followed the sound toward what had been the largest house in the settlement, its stone chimney still standing amid the collapsed walls. As I got closer to the ruins, the voices became clearer. I could make out individual words, fragments of conversation about daily life, someone discussing the harvest, another voice worrying about winter preparations, a woman singing what sounded like a lullaby. The voices had a quality that was both foreign and familiar, like hearing relatives speak a language you only half understood. I called out to Maria to come listen, but when she joined me, the voices stopped immediately. She looked at me with concern, asking if I was feeling okay, if maybe the hike had been too much. I insisted I'd heard people talking, but when we both stood there in silence, there was nothing but the sound of wind through the trees and the distant stream. We continued exploring the ruins, and I began taking detailed notes and photographs for my genealogy project. In what had been the foundation of the largest house, which I suspected had been my great-great-grandmother's home based on its size and central location, I found something that made my hands shake. Carved into one of the foundation stones, in letters that were still clearly visible after more than a century, was the name Elena Vasquez, along with a date, 1919. But as I knelt to photograph the carving, something impossible happened. The ruins around me began to change. The collapsed walls started reassembling themselves, rising from their foundations like a movie being played in reverse. The fallen timber straightened and rejoined. Windows materialized in empty frames. And within moments, I was kneeling not in ruins, but inside a fully intact house, complete with furniture, cooking utensils, and the warm glow of oil lamps. Maria was gone. I was alone in a house that had been destroyed decades before I was born, surrounded by the possessions of ancestors who had been dead for generations. But the most shocking thing was that I could see Elena Vasquez herself, my great-great-grandmother, sitting in a rocking chair by the fireplace. She was younger than in the one photograph I'd seen of her, maybe in her 40s, with dark hair streaked with premature silver and eyes that held a depth of knowledge that seemed ancient. She looked at me without surprise, as if she'd been expecting me. When she spoke, it was in Spanish. But somehow I understood every word, even though my Spanish was limited to what I'd learned in high school. "Mija," she said, using the term of endearment that my grandmother had always used for me. "You have finally come home. I have been waiting for you for so long." Her voice was warm and familiar, like an echo of voices I'd heard in childhood lullabies and family stories. I tried to speak, to ask her how this was possible, but she held up a hand to quiet me. "Time moves differently here, child. The past and present, they are not as separate as people believe. Our family's gift, it allows us to step between the moments, to visit the places where strong emotions have left their mark." She gestured around the fully restored house, and I could see that it was filled with life. Through the windows, I could see other houses in the settlement, smoke rising from their chimneys, people moving about their daily activities. Children played in the common area, their laughter carrying on the mountain air. This wasn't just a memory or a vision. This was Valle de los Susurros as it had been in its prime, somehow existing alongside its ruined present. "Why was the settlement abandoned?" I asked, though I wasn't sure if I spoke the words aloud or just thought them. Elena seemed to hear me either way. "We saw what was coming," she replied, her expression growing sad. "The gift runs strong in our bloodline, stronger in some generations than others. By 1920, many of us were seeing the same visions, a great sadness approaching, hard times that would last for years. The women with the sight, we convinced our families to leave before the worst of it came." "The Great Depression," I said, understanding immediately. Elena nodded. "We scattered to different places, different states, hoping to preserve what we could of the family line. But we always knew that one day, someone would return, someone with the gift strong enough to find us again." She stood from her rocking chair and walked over to me, reaching out to touch my face with hands that felt solid and warm. "You have the gift, Mija. Stronger than it's been in 3 generations. You can see the past because the past is not gone. It lives alongside the present, waiting for someone who knows how to look." She moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the room and retrieved something wrapped in embroidered cloth. When she unwrapped it, I saw that it was a hand-carved wooden box, intricately decorated with symbols that seemed to move and shift when I looked at them directly. This belonged to my grandmother in Spain, and her grandmother before her, It contains the family memories, the stories, the knowledge that we brought from the old country. She pressed the box into my hands, and immediately I was flooded with images, voices, memories that weren't my own. I saw Elena as a young woman in Spain, making the difficult decision to leave everything she knew. I experienced her journey to America, the hardships of establishing a new community in the wilderness, the joy of watching her children grow up speaking English and Spanish with equal fluency. But I also saw darker things, visions of the future that had driven the settlement's abandonment, glimpses of economic collapse and social upheaval that wouldn't come to pass for several more years. And I saw other women in my family line, generation after generation, each carrying a piece of Elena's gift, each using it to protect and guide their families through difficult times. The gift skipped your mother's generation, Elena explained, but it has awakened in you. You will be able to see the past, to learn from the mistakes and wisdom of those who came before. But you will also see the future, fragments of what might come to pass. Use this knowledge wisely. The vision began to fade around the edges, the solid walls of the house becoming transparent, the voices of the settlement growing distant. Elena herself started to fade, becoming translucent like morning mist. "Remember us?" she said as she disappeared. "Remember that the past lives alongside the present. That family never truly dies. It just waits to be found again. And when your time comes, you will teach the next generation how to find their way home." I found myself kneeling again in the ruins, the wooden box solid and real in my hands, Maria shaking my shoulder and asking if I was okay. According to her, I'd been kneeling motionless by the foundation stone for over an hour, not responding when she called my name. She was worried I'd had some kind of episode, maybe altitude sickness or dehydration. The box was still in my hands, as real and solid as anything I'd ever touched. When I opened it later that evening back in my dorm room, I found it filled with documents, photographs, and artifacts that chronicled my family's history in ways that no official records could. Birth certificates from Spain, letters written in multiple languages, pressed flowers that still retained their color after more than a century. But most importantly, I found Elena's journal, written in Spanish and English, documenting her experiences with what she called the sight. Her descriptions of visions, of conversations with ancestors, of the ability to step between different moments in time, matched exactly what I had experienced in the ruins. I've been back to Valle de los Susurros 3 times since that first visit, and each time I've been able to access more of the settlement's living history. I've spoken with other ancestors, learned family recipes that were never written down, even attended celebrations and gatherings that took place decades before I was born. My semester project on family genealogy turned into a comprehensive family history that went far beyond what any normal research could have uncovered. My professor was amazed by the depth and detail of my work, calling it graduate-level research. But I couldn't tell her the real source of my information, that I was literally interviewing my ancestors in person. The gift Elena spoke of has continued to develop. Sometimes when I'm in old buildings or historic sites, I'll catch glimpses of the past, see events that happened years or decades earlier playing out like ghostly movies. I've learned to control it somewhat, to focus on specific time periods or look for particular information. But the most remarkable thing is what's happening to my understanding of family. I now realize that death doesn't end our connection to the people we love. It just changes the nature of that connection. My ancestors aren't gone. They're waiting in the spaces between moments, ready to share their wisdom and their love with anyone who has the gift to find them. My name is Valeria, and I'm a college student who discovered that my family's past isn't past at all. It's alive and present, existing alongside our current reality, filled with ancestors who are still teaching, still guiding, still loving their descendants across the boundaries of time and death. And now that I know how to find them, I'll never be alone again. My name is Zaire, and I've been working highway maintenance for the Maryland State Highway Administration for 18 years. I know every mile of road in our sector, every pothole, every guardrail that needs replacing, every stretch of asphalt that gets slick when it rains. But last February, during the worst winter storm we'd seen in a decade, I found myself working on a road that doesn't exist on any map, installing signs that direct traffic to places that shouldn't be there. What happened that night has made me question everything I thought I knew about the infrastructure I've spent nearly 2 decades maintaining. The call came in at 11:30 p.m. on February 18th. I was already home, sitting in front of the TV with a beer and a leftover pizza, watching the weather reports about the storm system moving in from the west. Forecast was calling for 12 to 15 inches of snow, with winds gusting up to 40 miles per hour. The kind of weather that turns highways into nightmares and keeps maintenance crews busy for days. My supervisor, Dave Kowalski, sounded tired when he called. "Zaire, I need you to take the plow truck up to Route 40 between Mount Airy and Ellicott City. We got reports of multiple accidents, and the state police need that section cleared before the worst of the storm hits." I'd worked that stretch of road hundreds of times, knew every curve and every grade. It was a straightforward job, the kind I could do in my sleep. I loaded up the salt truck and headed out into weather that was already getting nasty. The snow was coming down heavy and wet, the kind that sticks to everything and makes visibility almost zero. By the time I reached the area Dave had described, the storm was bad enough that I could barely see the road markers through the snow. That's when I realized something was wrong. I'd been driving Route 40 for 18 years, but the landscape around me didn't look familiar. The curves were wrong, the grade was steeper than it should have been, and there were landmarks I didn't recognize. An old stone bridge that crossed a creek I'd never seen before. A cluster of abandoned buildings that should have been demolished years ago. I pulled over and checked my GPS, thinking maybe I'd taken a wrong turn in the storm. But according to the satellite navigation, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Route 40, mile marker 73. I'd installed that marker myself 3 years earlier, knew exactly what the surrounding area should look like. But nothing matched what I was seeing through the windshield. I radioed back to dispatch. "Dave, you there? I'm at mile marker 73 on Route 40, but something doesn't look right out here. You sure you gave me the right location?" Dave's voice crackled through the static. "That's the right spot, Zaire. State police are reporting multiple slide-offs in that area. Just do what you can to clear the road and get those warning signs posted." Warning signs. That's when I remembered the box of temporary road signs in the back of my truck, signs that Dave had loaded while I was checking the plow equipment. I hadn't paid much attention at the time, figuring they were standard construction and hazard warnings. But when I climbed out of the truck to retrieve them, I saw that they weren't standard at all. The signs were professionally made, same materials and fonts as our regular highway signs, but the destinations they referenced made no sense. Next exit, Millbrook Crossing, 2 miles. Detour to Riverside Community, follow County Road 847. Bridge out ahead, use alternate route to Pine Hollow. These weren't places on any map I'd ever seen, weren't destinations that existed anywhere in our sector. I radioed Dave again. "These signs you loaded, they're for places that don't exist. Millbrook Crossing, Riverside Community, Pine Hollow. None of these are on any of our maps. There was a long pause before Dave responded, and when he did, his voice sounded different, distant. Just install the signs where they're supposed to go, Zaire. Follow the route markers. Everything will make sense once you're done. Route markers. I looked around and saw them for the first time. Small reflective tags attached to fence posts and utility poles, barely visible through the snow, but definitely there. They led away from Route 40, down what looked like a county road that branched off toward the mountains. I'd never seen this road before, but the markers were clearly official highway department equipment. Against my better judgment, I followed the markers. The road was narrower than Route 40, twisting through terrain that got more mountainous as I drove. The snow was coming down even harder now, and my headlights barely penetrated the wall of white ahead of me. But the route markers kept appearing every few hundred yards, guiding me deeper into landscape that felt increasingly wrong. After about 20 minutes of driving, I came to the first location where I was supposed to install a sign. The marker was attached to a signpost that was already in place, as if it had been waiting for me. The location was a T intersection, where the road I was following met another paved road that disappeared into the darkness in both directions. According to the sign I was supposed to install, this intersection led to Millbrook Crossing. I got out of the truck and installed the sign, though every instinct I had was screaming that this was wrong. The intersection existed, the signpost was there, but neither road was on any map I'd ever seen. As I worked, I noticed vehicle tracks in the snow, recent tracks, as if cars had passed through within the last hour. But that was impossible. This road didn't exist an hour ago. The second location was even stranger. I was supposed to install a bridge warning sign at what the route markers indicated was Pine Hollow Bridge. When I reached the location, there was indeed a bridge, an old stone arch bridge that crossed a deep ravine. But the bridge was in perfect condition, not the damaged structure that would require a warning sign. The sign I installed read, "Bridge out ahead, use alternate route to Pine Hollow." But the bridge was clearly safe to cross. As I worked, I became aware that I wasn't alone. There were lights moving through the storm, other vehicles following the same route markers I'd been following. I watched them pass. Ordinary cars and trucks, their headlights cutting through the snow as they navigated roads that shouldn't exist toward destinations that couldn't be found on any map. The third and final location was where everything came together in a way that terrified me. The route markers led to what appeared to be a small mountain community, maybe 20 or 30 houses clustered around a central area with a few businesses, all lit up against the storm. The sign I was supposed to install read, "Riverside Community, elevation 1847 feet, population 127. But when I checked my altimeter, it showed I was at 2,300 feet elevation, not 1847. And when I looked more carefully at the community spread out below me, I realized that the buildings were wrong, too old. Architectural styles that hadn't been used in this area for decades. It looked like a community from the 1950s, perfectly preserved and somehow still functioning despite not existing on any modern map. I installed the sign, but as I worked, I noticed something that made my hands shake. There were other highway signs already in place around the community, signs that referenced roads and destinations I knew were real. Signs pointing toward Baltimore, toward Frederick, toward towns that definitely existed. But they were pointing in directions that made no geographical sense, as if this impossible community was somehow connected to the real world through pathways that defied normal geography. That's when I understood what was happening. I wasn't just installing signs for roads that didn't exist. I was creating connections between two different versions of reality. The roads I was working on existed in some parallel version of Maryland, a version where communities like Riverside and Millbrook Crossing had never been abandoned or demolished, where the highway system had developed differently. And the signs I was installing were creating bridges between that reality and ours, allowing people to travel between the two versions of the same landscape. The vehicle tracks I'd seen, the lights moving through the storm. Were people from our world accidentally stumbling into roads that led to places that existed alongside our reality, but separate from it? I finished installing the last sign and drove back the way I'd come, following the route markers in reverse. But when I reached what should have been Route 40, I found myself on a completely different road, one that led through terrain I didn't recognize. It took me 3 hours to find my way back to roads I knew, and by the time I reached the highway department garage, it was nearly dawn. Dave was waiting for me when I pulled in, and he looked relieved to see me. "Rough night out there," he said. But there was something in his eyes that suggested he knew exactly what kind of night I'd had. "Get the signs installed okay?" "Dave, what were those signs for? Where did those roads lead?" I asked. But he was already walking away, avoiding my questions. I spent the next week trying to find the roads I'd worked on that night. I drove every back road and county route in our sector, but there was no trace of the intersection where I'd installed the Millbrook Crossing sign, no sign of the bridge at Pine Hollow, no evidence of Riverside community. According to official maps and GPS systems, none of those roads existed. But people in the area started reporting strange things. Drivers getting lost on familiar roads, finding themselves in communities they'd never seen before, meeting people who claimed to be from towns that had been abandoned decades ago. The reports were always dismissed as stress, poor weather conditions, or simple disorientation. Last month, I found a box of route markers in the back of the maintenance garage, markers identical to the ones I'd followed that night. When I asked Dave about them, he just shrugged. "Emergency supplies," he said. "Sometimes we get calls to do work on roads that aren't on the regular maps. Infrastructure development, you know how it is. But I know it's more than infrastructure development. I think there are places that exist alongside our world, communities and roads that were never abandoned, never demolished, never forgotten. And sometimes, during the worst storms when visibility is near zero and normal navigation fails, maintenance crews like me get called to create temporary connections between our world and theirs. The scary part is that I don't think those connections are temporary. I think every sign I installed that night is still there, still directing traffic between two different versions of reality. And I think there are other crews, other maintenance workers who've been given the same job I was given, creating a hidden network of roads that connect places that shouldn't exist. My name is Zaire, and I'm a highway maintenance worker who spent one night working on roads that don't appear on any map. But they're real, and they're still there. And every time there's a severe storm in the mountains, I wonder if someone else is being sent out with a truck full of impossible signs to maintain infrastructure that exists in the spaces between what we think we know about the world. Sometimes, when I'm driving the regular roads during my normal shifts, I catch glimpses of those route markers in my peripheral vision, still guiding the way to places that exist just outside the edges of our reality. And I know that somewhere in the mountains, the signs I installed are still standing, still directing lost travelers to communities that time forgot, still maintaining connections between worlds that were never meant to touch. My name is Arya, and I'm 26 years old. Last summer, I took a job as a seasonal fire lookout at a remote tower in the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. It seemed like the perfect opportunity. Decent pay, solitude for writing, and a chance to spend months surrounded by nothing but wilderness and sky. The tower stood 90 feet above the forest canopy, accessible only by a winding dirt road that took 40 minutes to navigate even in good weather. I was supposed to work there from May through September, watching for smoke, reporting weather conditions, and maintaining radio contact with other towers throughout the forest. What I experienced during my final week alone in that tower has convinced me that some places in these mountains are windows into something far darker than forest fires. The tower itself was built in 1962, a steel structure with a small cabin at the top that contained all the equipment I needed. Radio, weather instruments, maps, binoculars, and a simple bed and kitchenette for the long shifts. During my first 3 months there, the job was exactly what I'd expected. I'd scan the horizon for smoke, record weather data, check in with dispatch twice a day, and spend my free time writing in a journal I'd brought along. The isolation was profound but peaceful, broken only by the occasional hiker who'd made the difficult climb to visit the tower. The other lookouts in the forest became my lifeline to human contact. There were 5 active towers in my sector, each staffed by seasonal employees like myself. We'd check in with each other daily on designated radio frequencies, sharing weather observations and just talking to break up the monotony. Sarah worked Tower 7, about 15 miles northeast of my position. Marcus was at Tower 12, 20 miles to the south. Linda had Tower 15, and James was stationed at Tower 3. We developed a routine over the summer, a daily conversation that helped all of us feel less alone in our respective perches above the forest. The strangeness began during my 4th month, in late August, when the season was winding down. Sarah was the first to mention it during one of our evening radio checks. "Anyone else been picking up weird transmissions lately?" she asked, her voice crackling through the static. "I keep hearing voices on frequencies that should be empty. Conversations that don't make sense." Marcus confirmed he'd been experiencing the same thing. "Yeah, I've been hearing them for about a week now. Sounds like other lookouts reporting fires, but the locations they're giving don't match anything on our maps. And the voices sound old somehow, like they're using equipment from decades ago." I hadn't noticed anything unusual at that point, but over the next few days I started paying closer attention to the radio chatter. That's when I heard them. Faint voices bleeding through on frequencies between our official channels. The transmissions were brief, usually just a few seconds, but they were definitely fire tower communications. Someone reporting smoke sightings, weather conditions, equipment problems. But when I tried to respond or ask for clarification, there was never any answer. The voices became clearer over the following week. I started recognizing patterns in the transmissions, specific call signs, individual voices that appeared repeatedly. One voice in particular caught my attention, a woman who identified herself as operating from Tower 4. According to my maps and the information I'd been given during training, Tower 4 had been decommissioned in 1987 after a lightning strike damaged it beyond repair. It had been demolished years ago, yet I was hearing regular transmissions from someone claiming to work there. I asked Linda about it during one of our check-ins. Tower 4 was torn down before I started working here, she confirmed. But I've been hearing those same transmissions. The woman who claims to be working there, she's been reporting the same weather conditions and fire sightings for the past 3 weeks. Same exact reports, word for word, like she's stuck in some kind of loop. That's when James shared something that made my blood run cold. "I looked up the old records," he said, his voice barely audible through the static. There was a lookout named Catherine Walsh who worked Tower 4 from 1983 until it was destroyed. She died in the lightning strike that took out the tower. And the voice we've been hearing, she's been identifying herself as Catherine Walsh. The implications of what James was saying hit me like a physical blow. We weren't just hearing random radio interference or equipment malfunctions. We were somehow receiving transmissions from dead fire lookouts. People who had worked towers that no longer existed, reporting conditions from decades in the past. But the truly terrifying part came during my final week on the job. I was scheduled to leave the tower on September 15th, and by September 8th, I was the only lookout left in the forest. Sarah, Marcus, Linda, and James had all finished their seasonal contracts and returned to their regular lives. I was completely alone, maintaining radio contact only with dispatch and preparing to close down the tower for winter. That's when I started hearing my own voice on the radio. It began as fragments, just a few words here and there that sounded like my voice, but were saying things I didn't remember saying. Then, over the course of 3 nights, the transmissions became longer and clearer. I was hearing myself conducting routine radio checks, reporting weather conditions, describing fire sightings in areas I could see were completely free of smoke. The most disturbing transmission came on September 12th, 3 days before I was supposed to leave. I heard my own voice, clear as day, conducting what sounded like a final radio check. This is Tower 8, signing off for the season. Weather conditions clear, no smoke visible in any sector. Equipment secured for winter shutdown. Catherine Walsh, over and out. But my name isn't Catherine Walsh. Catherine Walsh died in Tower 4 in 1987. And I was hearing my own voice claiming to be her, giving a final report from a tower that had been destroyed decades ago. I tried to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe it was some kind of atmospheric phenomenon that was bouncing old radio signals back from the ionosphere. Maybe there was equipment malfunction that was creating false transmissions. But the more I listened, the more convinced I became that something impossible was happening in these mountains. On my last night in the tower, September 14th, I decided to stay awake and monitor the radio frequencies continuously. What I heard during those final hours has haunted me every day since. Starting around midnight, I began picking up transmissions from all the decommissioned towers in the forest. Tower 4, Tower 6, Tower 9, Tower 11, and others that had been torn down or abandoned over the decades. Each transmission was from a different time period, lookouts reporting in from the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, each giving their final reports before their towers were closed forever. And mixed in with all those historical voices was my own voice, growing clearer and more frequent as the night went on. By dawn, I was hearing my own voice almost continuously, giving weather reports, fire sightings, and routine communications that spanned what sounded like an entire season of work. But it wasn't the season I'd just completed. The reports referenced fires I'd never seen, weather conditions I'd never experienced, equipment problems I'd never encountered. The final transmission came just as the sun was rising over the forest canopy. My own voice, tired but professional, giving what was clearly a final sign-off. This is Tower 8, Arya Patel reporting. Season complete. No active fires in sector. All equipment secured. Thanks for a good season, everyone. Tower 8. Out. But I hadn't made that transmission. I was sitting in the tower listening to my own voice say goodbye, signing off from a job I was still doing. I packed my equipment and hiked down from the tower that morning, 3 days early, not bothering to complete the official shutdown procedures. As I drove away from the Monongahela National Forest, I kept checking my rearview mirror, expecting to see smoke rising from Tower 8. But the forest remained quiet and peaceful. I never reported what I'd experienced to the Forest Service. How do you explain that you were receiving radio transmissions from dead fire lookouts? Or that you heard your own voice conducting an entire fire season that you never actually worked? They would have dismissed it as isolation-induced hallucinations or equipment malfunction. But 6 months later, I received a call from this year's seasonal coordinator, asking if I was interested in returning to Tower 8 for another season. The previous lookout left some great reviews of the position, she told me. Said it was the most fulfilling job she'd ever had, that she'd loved every minute of working in Tower 8. I never left any reviews of my experience. I never spoke positively about my time in that tower to anyone from the Forest Service. But somehow, somewhere, a version of me had completed that season and reported having a wonderful experience. My name is Arya, and I worked as a fire lookout in a tower that exists in multiple time periods simultaneously. I heard the voices of dead lookouts still working their shifts decades after their towers were destroyed. And I heard my own voice reporting from seasons I never worked. The mountains keep their own time, their own records, and their own versions of the truth. If you've experienced something similar in the mountains, or if you have your own story of encounters with the impossible in remote places, I'd love to hear from you. Share your experiences in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to Verified Fears for more true horror stories from people who've encountered the unexplained. Sometimes, the most terrifying experiences are the ones that make us question the very nature of time and reality itself.